Welcome, everyone, to SourceLab, Digital Documentary Publishing in the History Classroom. My name is Brendan Gillis. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning for the American Historical Association. And I am thrilled to be giving a brief introduction to today's webinar. After a fairly short presentation about SourceLab, the panelists will open up for a discussion based on some prearranged questions, and then they will field questions from the audience. This is a wonderful opportunity to shine a light on the potential for digital documentary editing and publishing in the history classroom. Today's event is part of AHA Learn, a series of online programs that provide a forum for compelling ideas and important conversations in history education. Today, we're very excited to be presenting this webinar in partnership with the AHA's Digital History Working Group. And the Digital History Working Group has provided today's moderator. Today's discussion will be moderated by my friend and colleague, Kalani Craig. Kalani is Associate Professor of History at Illinois Urbana-Champaign and was the co-director of the Institute for Digital Arts and Humanities at Indiana University Bloomington from 2017 to 2024. Her work is focused on the design of digital tools that shape new historical methods and classroom activities that help students engage with those new methods. She also serves as co-chair of the AHA's Digital History Working Group. Now, without further ado, I'll hand things over to Kalani.
Thank you. So special thanks to Brendan and the Teaching and Learning Group and to Jake and the AHA event staff for helping Jeff McClurkin, who is the other co-chair of the Digital History Working Group, broadcast this roundtable to our members. The DHWG's goal is to build digital history capacity across the entire discipline of history by providing resource and advice on the use of digital tools in historical research and teaching. Today's roundtable is part of that mission. There are also a set of sessions at the AHA's annual meeting in Chicago in early January, and Jake is going to post information about 3 specific sessions and a search term for digital history sessions in the chat now so that you have access to those and can come join us. Whether you're an expert with lots of funding or just learning about digital history, we really want to meet you. Please come introduce yourselves to us at these sessions, to the Digital History Working Group and 2 of today's roundtable presenters who will be joining us in Chicago. In addition to sessions on project showcases that will give you inspiration, we have short individual consults that are designed to help you and your students engage with history in our rapidly changing digital environments. And we would especially love to hear more about what other resources or needs you have so that the DHWG can serve all of our members' needs. With that in mind, let's have a look at one of those resources. Our roundtable today is an exploration of SourceLab, a historical document editing and publishing toolkit developed by John Randolph, who's an associate professor and director of the Ruston East European and Eurasian Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I'm pleased to be one of his new colleagues now that I've joined UIUC from Indiana University. John's work as a cultural and intellectual historian of the Russian Empire includes the history of family life as well as the history of communication. And it's in that latter vein that John founded SourceLab in 2015 as a digital humanities collective focused on the future of the historical record. SourceLab was developed with the support of the Humanities Without Walls Consortium, and it's designed to help students get hands-on experience, framing and contextualizing primary sources that show up on the internet. Today, John is going to give us a 10-minute overview of SourceLab's history and some practical classroom tips and examples that he's had in students' use of SourceLab. We'll then call on John and 2 additional SourceLab representatives for an open conversation about SourceLab as a transformative set of practices that are shaping history classrooms, both for seasoned and early career instructors alike, and as a way to connect historical thinking practices to the ways disciplines outside of history can and should work. Those 2 extra members are Owen Monroe, who uses digital methods to study science. I can talk today. To study science in Victorian periodicals. He's a member of the SourceLab editorial board, and he's interested in creating digital editions for teaching and research. Our other SourceLab affiliate is Richard Young, a digital historian studying the cultural history of happiness in modern America. He builds computational tools to analyze how advertising, psychology, and consumer culture shaped emotional life in the 20th century. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to John for our overview of SourceLab.
Thank you very much, Kalani. Thank you, Brendan and Jake and all of your colleagues at the American Historical Association. Thank you to all the colleagues who are joining us today for this webinar. I know it's a very hectic time at the end of the semester. I was actually just teaching a class until about 20 minutes ago. So hopefully your semesters are finishing up well, and this will be a nice entry point into a well-deserved holiday break. So let me start by sharing my PowerPoint here, and I will begin by talking about SourceLab. Hold on just a second here. Oh. Continue to share. Can everyone see it now? The opening slide of the presentation? Okay,
Yes,
great.
looks great.
All right, so about SourceLab. SourceLab started in 2014, formally in 2015. And the origin story we tell about it is this. 2014 was, of course, the centenary of the outbreak of World War I. We had many colleagues who were looking at teaching classes on it. And one of our colleagues went and did what many of us do nowadays, sought to mine the internet for interesting sources she could use to bring to her class to talk about the broader dimensions of the war. And she found something wonderful on YouTube. It was a short film, a still from it is pictured here, that seemed to be of a group of artists who seemed to be creating prosthetic faces for men injured in the war. As a launch point for students, this short film is about 5 minutes, is great. It's a fascinating artifact that sits at the intersection of the histories of medicine, the history of war, history of cosmetic surgery, history of film. It's exactly the kind of found media object that was almost impossible to integrate into classroom discussions during our long print era, and also an example of the kind of sources the new historical record growing up online churns out in great quantity. It's the abundance part of Roy Rosenzweig's famous comment in 2003 already that we live in an era of abundance as well as scarcity in terms of the shape of the historical record. The flip side of the coin, however, as I'm sure you're already guessing, is that we knew almost nothing about this source, not who made it, nor who the artists were in it, nor whether they had, whether we were looking at all or only part of the film. What was its current archival repository location? Was it a real film? Was it something that was created on Photoshop in Canada as like a still for some larger work? The provenance questions surrounding this particular object were simply immense. The user who posted it online had a name something like Gregory123. It was a very difficult object to present to students knowledgeably as something they could build their own understandings about the past around. And as as a history community, our history department had very limited means of dealing with this kind of situation. We were all trained and used to the idea that history sources were published and curated by someone else, that we would be given them in a frame suitable for our interpretive work and teaching work and research work by publishers, librarians, and archivists. And yet we increasingly live in a world where tomorrow's historical sources are published without such a framework, without such archival and editorial research. And one thing I might say about scarcity or abundance, Roy Rosenzweig's call for thinking about this new historical record in 2003 is, at that point, of course, we were dealing largely with an internet that was more or less institutionally generated, one that was being produced by very large organizations that were capable of putting things online. In the social media era, obviously, we're dealing with a world in which sources are increasingly produced through social media. People are all documentarians nowadays. It's an era where publishing as a practice has really gone viral. In addition, the nature of the historical craft itself has changed, as Ian Milligan talked about a few years ago at the AHA. When historians go to archives nowadays, we return with thousands of photographic facsimiles that in theory we could share, but we don't necessarily have the publishing training to actually do so. So we end up with a new historical record that is partly radically decontextualized material. Part of it, of course, is just fake. Some of it increasingly is phantasmagorically generated by AI. It's a real complicated situation. So within that world, it was troubling to us that we as a department had no classes about how to think like a documentary editor, how to approach a source from the point of view of how it was created and published. No research capacity to help instructors, researchers, or the public at large responsibly and knowledgeably draw upon found media sources that they discovered online. No means of sharing that research and thereby helping improve the shape of the historical record. The internet, I've come to realize, is essentially a giant decontextualization machine, but we had no means to clean up our particular corner of it. The Bedford series, to use another analogy, is going to be forever producing a YouTube video as a special edition for use in classroom teaching, and yet we kind of have a need for such series, such publications within our practice. Now, in effect, I think what was happening is we were encountering the long tail of professionalization decisions made over a century ago, when archival science, scholarly publishing, and the field of history began to subdivide into specialist subfields, something that no doubt made a ton of sense at the time in the print era, and something that, of course, is still relevant and important for training today, but also a division of labor that also perhaps can be a roadblock to working with the fluid, socially generated, digital-first media environment in which we increasingly access historical sources. So SourceLab then was formed as a digital documentary editing program and community based within our history department and specifically within the history classroom to try to develop some capacity for dealing with these situations. The first thing we did is we developed a curriculum that trains students in the basics of editorial thinking and documentary publishing. I'll loosely call this digital media literacy in reverse. So instead of reading sources someone else has prepared for them, the students in this general education class, History 207, create new editions of sources for people to use based on objects and items that are brought to them by clients. So it looks something like this as a process. Every fall, we issue a call for proposals while we're teaching this class, History 207, and we get proposals from clients who bring to us all kinds of different subjects, all kinds of different sources. In some cases, it's something like I just described. You have an instructor, you have a researcher, you have a public historian who's found something online, and they don't know what the heck it is, but they sure would like to use it in their professional activity. They sure would like to use it in the classroom. They sure would like to use it in their teaching. Sometimes it's the case of a researcher who maybe has a resource that they themselves have created, but they're not quite sure how to frame it up as a documentary edition for public use. Sometimes you have public history projects which are interested in kind of creating a firmer foundation underneath the materials that they are sharing. We've worked with our local World Museum on campus, the Spurlock Museum, to produce editions of some of their artifacts. So wide variety of clients bring us these projects. Then in History 207, which again is a general education class, we have students who are presented these project ideas. They look at these various proposals. They choose the ones they would wish to work on. They team up in groups of 3 or 4 students per project. And over the course of the semester, they try to produce prototype editions. So these are fully mocked up scholarly editions of these particular objects that involve all kinds of editorial research into provenance, into copyright, into ethical questions. They create a kind of stable frame of reference for these objects, a way to cite them, and they also create a presentation or an editorial version of these particular source documents. By the end of the semester, this yields us an assignment, a prototype edition. At that point, the projects can just stop. It is a class after all. These are just students doing classwork. And yet, and I think that's a very valuable educational experience in and of itself. And I'll talk maybe more about that later. But we also have a structure in the department which has a series of kind of independent study possibilities for continuing work on these projects to put them through a peer review process at Illinois. We have an open publishing unit within our university library, which is called iOpen. And the peer review process that we have worked up is such that students who kind of develop their projects, pass them through this peer review, can both earn academic credit for that and at the same time eventually end up with a publication through our university open publishing division. So the goal after one semester is an unpublished prototype, and the goal more generally is to familiarize students with the craft of producing and presenting objects online in a way that they are more useful, more complete for scholarly use in teaching and research and public history. What are some of the benefits of this process? I think looking at a source from the other side, looking at it from the point of view of presentation, obviously leads them, it kind of demystifies the question of what is a historical source. It kind of opens their imagination to that, I think. It opens them to a number of information science and editorial and archival skills, things like metadata, markup, the philosophy of editing as all as topics. It gets them into a space where they're not just thinking critically about a source in the sense of, can I trust it in the abstract, but rather, how did this actually come to us? And how is it produced over time? What is its life cycle within culture? And what am I doing to help preserve it for the future? And in that sense, I think it encourages a kind of pluralistic way of thinking about sources, less as biased or unbiased, which tends to be kind of the classic question that students end up with initially, good or bad, but rather as objects with their own life histories and biographies. For our department, it generates something of a capacity to bring in new kinds of sources without necessarily waiting for other people to generate them and to engage flexibly with the internet. It obviously puts students in contact with clients and gives them that kind of experience. I think it opens them up as well to other kinds of career paths, other kinds of professions that are in dialogue with history, things like archival science, editorial science, and in that sense kind of opens up the history major. Um, uh, I also think in terms of our graduate program, we have 2 graduate students here today, so I won't say too much more about that, but it is the situation where this class, having been developed by the department, is beginning to be taught as well by graduate students. So it gives an option for graduate students to develop their pedagogy skills by learning this kind of curriculum. And I think it also gives them experience with helping mentor students on kind of complex editorial projects, larger scale projects. I think I'm probably out of my 10 minutes, but I might just real quickly show some examples of the projects. So let me just switch here to my other screen. Oh, actually, sorry, I shouldn't have done that right away. Let me go back to Zoom here, share. Let me go back to the PowerPoint real quick. So here is an example of the edition of Red Cross Works on Mutilés, which is our critical edition. It was kind of our prototype based on that film that I showed you at the very beginning. This was done by 2 students back in 2018, Allison Marcotte and Alex Villanueva, and this is published as part of our iOpen series. That's why I'm able to show it to you. We have also more recently have projects on things like there was a newsletter from a camp for homeless men in the Depression, and we published one of those newsletters as kind of a rare source presented to us by a colleague in Nebraska. It turns out we have the final letter from the Franklin expedition in our university archives, and so we prepared an edition of that. Antoinette Burton, our scholar of British Empire, is working on a visual grammar kind of British imperial history, and she gave us several images, editorial cartoons, as it were, from Punch, and we did editions of those from the Second Afghan War. One of my favorite editions, which I actually will perhaps show you a little bit later, is an edition called House Crops Dean. It features a film pamphlet from the 1930s from Illinois Wesleyan University, touting a program that would allow students to pay for university tuition with agricultural products. So you can imagine a film where like a man hands the dean a pig, and the pigs and the dean says he can study English. It's quite a movie, and it really is revealing of kind of the history of education in the 30s during the New Deal. So we have other editorial projects, but maybe I'll just stop there, and hopefully that's enough to give you a sense of what SourceLab is.
That was lovely. Thank you, John. So for our audience, one of our goals today is for us to use the experiences that John and the other panelists have had in using SourceLab in the classroom to answer a couple of questions that we hope will help give you inspiration, let you think through the ways in which you might use these in your classrooms, what kinds of resources you need to make that work. To that end, we've got a couple of questions that will help prompt all three of our panelists to sort of have an open, informal conversation. While they are doing that, we do have a Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom window that you can ask questions. So please feel free to open up your questions to that Q&A. I will keep an eye out for those as we go through our 4 prompting questions and see if I can bring things in that are relevant as we go through so that the audience has the chance to insert some questions into our conversation. And we'll also have an open Q&A once we've got about 10 minutes to go in the session, which ends at 4:30, so that anything that we didn't cover in our conversation does come up. So let's start with the first of these questions, and I'm going to have Owen and Richard contribute in addition to John. The first big one that John has semi-addressed, but that I wanted to get into a little more detail on is to ask all three of you how SourceLab has changed your teaching practices in your classroom. And there's some framing here to be had that Owen is not in the history department, although Richard is. And so there are some different perspectives here. And as you think about that, one of the particular things I think our audience members will be interested in is suggestions or resources for how other teachers might adopt this model. So I'm going to open the floor to the three of you to talk about what this has done to your work in classrooms here at Illinois.
I feel like I just talked a lot, so I don't know if Richard or Owen, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to speak a little bit. I mean, admittedly, my teaching experience at the university has been somewhat limited. I've mainly been helping SourceLab in sort of what we've been calling SourceLab Mondays. And I've been working sort of one-on-one or in small groups with students, undergrads and graduate students, to help with basically technical questions. And I found that more and more my role in this has been as a sort of mediator between the sort of technical knowledge that students need in order to build digital editions and the historical concerns that are involved when we package those sources, or whatever source we're working with in that way. So I mean, I have felt that it definitely has impacted what I think about how to teach. I mean, even when I sit down and work with a student now, I'm thinking about what they actually need to know about what it is that we're working with. And often it isn't the deep technical things. It's the specific maneuver they need to do in order to get their source on a web page. And that's been very useful.
So do I hear you saying then that this isn't just shaping the way that you think about classrooms, it's shaping the way that you think about informal experiences with students and informal learning environments?
Definitely. I found working with grad students especially has been interesting because they come to me with usually problems that they're having. Like I have too much. A friend of mine came to me and basically framed the problem they were having as the problem that Ian Milligan pointed out, which is they have too many photographs from their archival trips, and they just need help like making sense of the thousands of photographs they've taken. And for them that seems like a huge feat, but I can approach it from a technical standpoint and give them some very quick tools that'll help them do that. So informal problems become quickly addressed in this space.
I could say something about that. I mean, I think one of the things that became very apparent when we started to do this kind of practice over the past decade was it's hard for it not to become something where you're really, and I think one of the advantages of it is you're really collaborating with the students. You're really problem solving with the students about how they're going to take this kind of creative project of presenting a source so that people can use it, mediating between their technical experience, their intellectual understanding of the source, their understanding of kind of source craft and editorial craft. And I think one of the things I've enjoyed from the curriculum is precisely how quickly it shifts you into this kind of, collaborative phase where you're really working together with the students. Now, Richard also um, mentioned SourceLab Monday. So one of the things that became immediately apparent as well is that there were going to be all kinds of questions that were coming out of this. And, for the first couple of years, I was batting away a large number of emails from students asking me individual questions. And eventually I had the brainstorm that, well, no, what I need to do is set up a kind of public office hours that are basically my office hours for my teaching responsibilities, but in a kind of public forum where I could sit with other people who are also interested in these kinds of questions, and work with students there on their projects. So it's a kind of, I guess it involves a certain amount of social collaboration with people that's really interesting.
Owen?
Yeah, so I'm a graduate student in the School of Information Science, as I mentioned before, and I teach a course that I've taught for many semesters called Reading and Writing About Data. And my experience with SourceLab in general has definitely shaped and informed the way that I have taught this class, and have changed it over time. So for this class, I have really incorporated some of those elements to encourage students to sort of research and find reliable like data sources for their own kind of data analysis projects. And a big key for my class is a lot of my students are interested in data science or data science careers. So what I try to do in my class is teach them not just how to analyze data, but how to take their data analysis and interpret it to really solve a problem, but also have kind of a context of where that data comes from, how it was collected, and how their kind of analysis can lead them to write an argument and have a real strong interpretation or argument that can serve an audience. So I've over time developed kind of a final project for my students that's collaborative, where they both analyze data, talk about where it comes from, but also present like a strong argument with voice that really goes beyond analysis towards more like decision making is how I think about it. So that sort of combination of analysis and interpretation, or analysis and argument, I've learned a lot from SourceLab, but also trying to add that to my information science course. Another thing too is I've learned through SourceLab and being involved with one of the graduate courses taking as a student is the value of sort of seeing how sources or data fits into information systems through things like metadata. And so teaching my students like the value of citation and understanding how to find data sets or sources, and how metadata allows us to find that information as well as bring it into a new system or a new report. So I feel like that has really helped me take those kind of lessons from history and the humanities and apply them to my students. And students in my class often really enjoy their work, where they're kind of used to writing these kind of data analysis reports. But in my class, I say we're going to be more creative. We're going to push towards a real written argument that sort of contributes to a problem or contributes an intervention to a certain issue. So I feel like those elements have sort of showed how my work in information science has been sort of inflected by history and the humanities.
I love that. I mean, the idea of historians and our historical thinking practices contributing to and changing how data literacy works is amazing. So one of the questions that I asked as a sort of side note to this, how has this changed your teaching practice, is thinking about suggestions or resources for how other people might adopt the model. And we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, one from Patrick Lee. Hi, Patrick. Is SourceLab an open source tool that is accessible to others? And are there discussions about making the tool set itself available for others to implement? And a sort of corollary to that is from Harlan Graydon, who works for a state humanities council, helping build programs for a general local public audience. The interest in the project is how to make it useful for community groups so that they can own the process of production. So I'm going to turn it back to you, and then we'll come back to, we've got one more that I think is actually relevant from Katharina Herring asking about the technical background. It looks like Scalar. What are the experiences with Scalar? What are the collaboration platforms that you're considering now?
Yeah, thank you for all of those questions. So let me try to take them roughly in order. I think they actually relate to each other in a deep way. So SourceLab's it's not a tool, so it's not a software package. At this point, what we are is kind of uh, a curriculum within a history department, a sort of digital humanities collective within a history department that is interested in developing um, teaching practices, teaching modules to help integrate scholarly publishing, documentary publishing into classroom experiences. So what we can offer is I actually sent a copy of my syllabus for History 207, so I'm happy to have that shared out. And what you'll see there is sort of readings that try to take students through both what is editorial thinking? What does it mean to approach a source from the point of view of someone who's publishing it as opposed to someone who's reading it, consuming it? And then also blocks out scaffolds the construction of a prototype over the course of a semester. We use open technologies. Let me get to the Scalar question in that regard. You're quite right. We began this project using Scalar as our digital publishing platform. And that was great in a number of ways. I want to credit Scalar in some ways for actually helping us conceive this whole project, because one of the things about Scalar is that it forces people to make a kind of intellectual distinction between their own web presentation and the archive from which they are drawing the source that they are presenting. So Scalar, by its nature, is kind of a framing platform where a media object is framed, and that was very handy. I would say that we're currently transitioning away from Scalar. Part of that has to do with just the kind of technological development of that platform over time, and the resources it takes to maintain our own University of Illinois server for Scalar. I think another part of it is we've been more recently quite influenced by the so-called minimal computing movement, which is oriented towards, against, or away from, as an introductory mechanism for students, kind of what you see is what you get, all-in-one digital tools. So what we're trying to do now is have students build static websites using GitHub Pages, which is an openly accessible technology, which will eventually yield to you a raw static website, which you could then port onto any kind of public server, whereas Scalar would require a kind of particular setup. But I think very broadly speaking, we're also striving to be platform independent. I mean, I think the thing that we're really trying to zero in on is what kinds of information, what kinds of data should people be gathering about a source as they begin to think about presenting it? I sometimes joke that, or not joke, this is somewhat serious. I think the AHA, I think we as historians would benefit from developing some sort of app I'll loosely call Historicize, which basically is like ingests an object through our camera, but then also prompts us to record certain basic bits of data, I'll call it metadata, about that source, which, if you actually kept together with that source, would make it more consistently usable both by yourself and by future generations. We're in the process right now of generating this massive photo archive, but again, so much of it is detached from the kinds of information and frameworks which would make it citable, usable on many different dimensions for scholars. So I think that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do, and what we also can try to offer is some experience, whether you end up as a group using Scalar or Omeka or WordPress or Pressbooks or GitHub Pages, or your own self-designed Drupal page, whatever your web presentation is, what's the intellectual architecture under that is what we're trying to get at. And in terms of community organizations, from the state organization member I saw there briefly, I think we have been trying to work with public organizations on kind of thinking about their sources. And I also think this might be a way of trying to scaffold classroom experiences dealing with the sources used by a public organization. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's
I'm going to hop in really quickly to add moderator's privilege to answer Harlan's question. One of the things that one of my teams and I have been doing, and it's one of the reasons I found John's SourceLab work so compelling when I first encountered it prior to becoming his colleague here at Illinois, is that there are lots of platforms out there for community archiving purposes, post-custodial or anti-custodial. One of them is part of a team project that I've been working on that is ACLS funded. I'm actually going to put the link for that in the Q&A for Harlan, and I'll ask Jake if he can send it to everyone. There are a number of different ways of slicing and dicing different historical documents. What SourceLab's platform independent approach focuses on is an individual primary source. The digital arc platform that I just posted in the answer to Harlan's is to look at many objects in context in a community-driven, community-owned context, but it draws on the same minimal computing platform thinking that John is working with, and it can be platform independent. So I think there's lots and lots of ways to work through that. I'm happy to answer questions about that afterwards to keep the focus on SourceLab. And I want to come back to one of the things that I keep hearing the three of you talk about, and that I've heard from that I'm seeing sort of as implicit questions in the audience Q&A, which is, how have your students responded? How has this changed their experience, both in your classrooms and in terms of connecting historical thinking to the things that they're doing outside of your classrooms and outside of those informal learning environments where you're the primary contact?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think for my kind of unique experience, I mentioned a bit before, a lot of my students have experience kind of writing data analysis reports for other professors where they have a big data set, and then the professor says, do a couple linear regression tests and report back what you have. And then in my class, I try to think about, well, encourage them to think about what kind of decisions or arguments that kind of analysis can lead to or can support. And so trying to connect their idea of data analysis with argument and sort of interpretation that is guided for an audience. So my class focuses a lot on writing and writing like argumentatively and for different audiences with data as evidence. But I think also like working with SourceLab has encouraged me to help students kind of see where their data comes from and how they kind of analyze it in different parts of their sources for research or their data, sort of speak to each other in a way that can kind of create more forms of evidence for their kind of argument. And I think being at SourceLab Monday, I've also learned kind of ways to informally kind of scaffold that work, I would say, of like how to look for that kind of context and information that surrounds like a source or something people found online, like a source or a data set, and then how to kind of take note of that and incorporate that into their thinking. So I've definitely seen and learned that in kind of informal SourceLab settings, but also that's helped me create my sort of formal project for my students where they have to both propose a data set to work with and then create a argumentative report that has a real kind of measured impact for their kind of argument based on data where they kind of know a fuller context and have kind of an audience and solution in mind.
Okay.
I would also, I mean, one of the things that I've observed is that, and I'm sure this is true of anyone who's out there who's involved in any kind of public history project with students, but so on the one hand, it activates students' desires to do things for other people, and it gets them engaged that way. The idea of working on a public resource is exciting in a way that working on a more normal paper isn't always, let's put it that way. I also think that it gives humanities majors a story to tell about themselves a little bit. So, if they're in an interview situation and someone's asking them, what kinds of things have you worked on? It gives them, they can talk about how they were working on this project. And I think we live in a society that has a broad public interest in history, but oftentimes it's kind of hard for people to know exactly where to talk about things. But everybody kind of likes these life stories, these kind of detective stories about an artifact that they can learn about and they can talk about. So I think that has been a really good side to the experience. I do think it has educational benefits. Many of our departments have these kind of capstone courses where we ask for senior majors to write research papers, and that's fantastic. But this offers a kind of capstone experience from the point of view, and I guess one of the logics behind the capstone experience is stop being a consumer of history, become a producer of history. And this is kind of an analog to that. Stop being a consumer of sources, become a real producer of sources. And I think that also has had some appeal. So thank you.
Richard,
I mean,
anything to add in terms of what your students experience?
Yeah, on a very similar vein to that. I mean, I think one of the things I've really noticed in working with students is just the level of excitement that when the page goes up and they see their source, they see what they've written on the page, sort of displayed in a web format. They feel like, it seems like they feel like they've really done something that's visible and like useful. And I think it's harder for them to feel that way sometimes when they're writing essays or publishing something in a journal. I mean, that's useful and important, but um, being able to put something out on the internet is really exciting to students.
So we've got a couple of follow-up questions. I'll tackle the one from Susan, who asks what we mean when we talk about scaffold or scaffolding, and the general educational research answer to that is breaking really long, complex projects down into small steps. But I think there are some specific things that are scaffolded in the SourceLab, so I'll let you talk about that. In the context of one of the other class form questions from Pearl Young about rethinking how scrapbooks function, both the historical ones that are in archives and the ones that she's creating, that getting students to think about how those are put together over time and who decides what gets saved is part of that production process as opposed to a consumption process. So can you talk about how you're scaffolding that production process and what specific steps you take?
It's interesting. Actually, one of the projects in our current History 207, which I just finished teaching today, is precisely a family archive. And it's specifically a kind of a family binder that's kind of a scrapbook for the family. It's a family that moved from Tennessee to Chicago in the mid 20th century. So, I think again, one of the things that I think is useful about editorial thinking, as it were, or publishing thinking, is that since from the beginning we're immersed in the question of, what is the life story of this object? Like, how did it come to be? I show them the Shelley Godwin Archives presentation of the manuscript of Frankenstein, where you can see both Mary Shelley's original manuscript, and you can see her husband sort of scrawl across the top and kind of crossing out and correcting things. And it gets you this idea of Frankenstein is not just this eternal text that kind of dropped out of the sky, but was produced in some way. And so I think that lends itself naturally to composite objects like a family archive, which have achieved some unity over time as an object, but nonetheless are made up of distinct elements that have just different histories of their own. And one of the things we posed to the question of that group this year is, one of an editor's job is to do contextualizing research, and one of the contextual research essays that they wrote had to do with the history of family archive making. So part of the series of steps, or the scaffold, that is involved in creating this project, one element of it is a kind of biographical approach to the history of the object, and another is a kind of contextual approach where you try to develop the knowledge base you need to really present the source. I think one thing that's both a challenge and also is exciting about this curriculum is oftentimes students have no concept of the history of that is involved in the source that they're publishing, right? They come in, they are presented projects, and they have to kind of scramble a little bit to learn about these things. But then again, that kind of shows them that they have developed research skills as history students. They are capable of going into the library and discovering information on something about which they knew nothing fairly recently.
That's actually a great transition to one of the questions that we've just gotten, and one of the questions I wanted to ask. From Daisy Herndon, a question about how these kinds of approaches might impact public history and who generates it. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you all about was, how do you think about academic knowledge production, both in terms of production and accessibility after having worked with SourceLab? Like, who's responsible for that, and how has your thinking about who's responsible for that work changed because of SourceLab, not just in terms of these smaller scale student projects, but in terms of the larger academic publishing world?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. I think, yeah, that question of knowledge production is really interesting. And I think talking about sort of what John was mentioning about scaffolding, where you sort of bring in the biography of the source, its contextualization, but then at the same time, you have the source, you kind of integrate it into the platform that you're using, whether it's sort of Scalar or something else. And then the student also begins to write sort of an introduction or a presentation of the source. And then all of these elements kind of come into one structure. And I feel like that really shows students how we go from just an image, a piece of data or a source, towards real knowledge about the source that incorporates that kind of context, that kind of history of the source, and then a kind of presentation. So we kind of go from information to knowledge there, I think. And I think that the question of who's doing that, to me, it's very collaborative in a lot of ways. Like John was saying, we get sort of clients who might send in a source and say, I'm interested in this, I found it in this archive, but I want this to be developed further. I think it shows that like all students can kind of get involved and say, oh, I see this source, I'm going to look into it, then I'm going to build this kind of structured presentation online, that I'm helping move from source or information or data towards historical knowledge through a system that it's not just writing about it, but it's really showing those pieces, kind of how they fit together through things like the structure, the metadata, the research and citations and things like that. So I think it really shows how there is this sort of collaborative element that on the internet we have all kinds of things there, but also like what responsibilities do we have to use those things sort of ethically, and think about like how can cultural heritage have a place online that's really meaningful and that really adds to knowledge. So I think that that's sort of a collaborative thing that students work on sort of formally together in SourceLab, but also they might have these kind of more indirect relationships with the professor or a client or someone who has a family scrapbook that they brought in. So it shows this really great, I think, sort of evolution from source to historical knowledge that's then becomes public as well.
Richard, you're a tool builder. Like, what's your sort of take on this?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think about the role that historians ought to play in this environment, and I think part of the um, nature of the current moment is that the internet, as John sometimes calls it, is a decontextualization machine. I've also heard people say it devours trust, um, and I think that's very much the case, especially in the current sort of political and just internet environment. So I don't actually have a great sense of what the future of knowledge production is going to look like. But if we want that to be good, we're going to need historians really seriously engaging with these spaces and finding ways to make these spaces into useful fonts of knowledge.
So I think that's a great transition into my last question for you all, and I want to encourage the audience to put your Q&A into the chat because we'll open things up. But how does this shape your futures, the three of you, but especially the two of you who are early career? What does this mean for you from a professional development perspective, and how are you thinking about this as you engage in planning the rest of your lives?
That's a great question. Yeah, I can speak to that. Yeah, when I began my graduate program, I was very interested in digital humanities and kind of cultural analytics as kind of a space in the field. And in my research, I use coding to understand very kind of difficult to work with sometimes periodical archives and find what articles I think are interesting or deal with kind of science in more kind of heterogeneous periodicals. I try to kind of extract the articles on science to understand how more sort of prevailing or expert science was popularized for a general audience. So I, you know, like use coding to kind of find those texts and then make my own interpretation argument. But through SourceLab, I realized there's a whole other element there, which is like building that kind of index of texts that I have kind of extracted and found interesting. So that has led me to kind of combine in my head both this work of like interpretation as kind of a historian of the book or print historian or historian of science, along with being kind of an information scientist who's interested in how historical texts can be presented and structured with context for others. And so it's led me to consider like publishing through a venue like SourceLab to think about how I might present the texts that I've discovered or that I've kind of encountered in easier archives that might allow us to move kind of from archive to interpretation more smoothly based on certain questions. So yeah, it's led me to think about a career that might involve, yeah, kind of both history and information science, whether that might be, I'm looking at, possibly a career as a professor, but potentially also as a digital humanities librarian or a role like that, where can think about how digitized material that might be digitized sometimes in ways that is actually hard to access can be made easier to access, especially for historians to use that to turn it into knowledge and interpretation, if that makes sense.
I think for me, it's been a really it's been a great source of confidence in terms of like the future development of my career. Having this sort of alternate skill set, being able to write code, being able to, throw up a digital archive or create an interesting visualization, and being able to teach those things makes me feel like I'm not necessarily, many of us are aware that, getting an academic job is really quite a thing. But having like a flexible skill set and learning to pivot in this sort of intellectual space, I think like frees up the possibility of A, working in other areas, but B, I think the things that you're going to bring to a job presentation are just going to be so unique and so sort of experimental that, maybe you don't land that one history job that you like, but I think the odds that you land something are much greater.
John, how does this feel mid-career? And then we've got a question from the audience. That's great.
It feels great mid-career. I really enjoyed this curriculum. And I guess my big theme that I'll come back to in terms of its intersection with the future of public history is it does seem to me we've dropped into a space where everyone's a publisher. We're all documentarians now. It's just that we're not taught, we don't talk about it. It's kind of this sort of social practice. It's funny when I first started to talk about we need a documentary editing curriculum, to a certain extent, people were like, well, what's that? That's completely outside of experience. But meanwhile, documentary publishing has gone viral. Like that's basically all people do anymore is take out their phone, shoot pictures of stuff and put it online, right? So there's all kinds of documents happening all the time. And I think, as historians, it's interesting for us to think about that process and the skills involved.
Daisy Herndon asks, is this part of a trend toward developing public educational opportunities? And how do we do that with non-academics in ways that use historical sources more reliably, responsibly, and ethically?
I think it is. I think many departments are very interested, of course, in kind of the public facing, and the internet culture is itself public facing in a lot of ways. I will say that one of my big areas, one of the main reasons I think it's extremely important that we as historians do this is that there are, of course, a huge number of ethical questions surrounding these practices. How knowledge creation is shared among institutions, that it's not extractive in its relationship to communities, and I think and that here Kimberly Kristen's work on creating the indigenous platform Mukatu is really exemplary as a way of kind of trying to think not just about copyright, which is like the obvious question, but also just like, should we share this? Can we use this? How should we use this? History is often fairly imperious in its relationship with people. We tend to assume that we can just use anything we can find, which for academic freedom is very good, but ethically is not always good. So, I think it gives also a space to be thinking about these kinds of issues, as well as, of course, the utility of what we do in the classroom. I'm definitely a firm believer that there's a lot of work we could be doing in the classroom which could have public impact. And I think that's important to sort of think about how that would be.
I'm going to link this to something Owen said earlier in terms of the thoughtful use of data sets. I've heard in a number of different spaces, but the one that I'm coming up with is Caroline Cinders, who's a data feminist, that every data point in a large data set was originally a person. And so, right, that's the work of historians, and thinking about the ways in which a data set was built and who built it and why it was built shapes the kind of analysis that can and should be done on it. Mukatu is a great example of, when pieces of a community's cultural heritage shouldn't be accessed by people outside of that community or by people with roles in that community that don't traditionally offer access to those sources is a crucial part of what I think we're all grappling with, really, when it comes to the idea of everyone being a digital documentarian. And on that note, we have reached time. This was amazing. I want to thank all three of you for your contributions. John Randolph, Owen Monroe, and Richard Young, all from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, with, again, a call out to SourceLab, digital documentary publishing in the history classroom. On behalf of all of us at the AHA, I hope the session was useful and productive for all of our audience members. Please do come join us at the American Historical Association annual meeting in Chicago, with a shout out to those sessions that I mentioned at the beginning. Friday at 1:30, digital project showcases will give you 3-minute quick hits of more projects like this, followed immediately by session 1:30. Ask a Digital Historian Anything, where you can get 15 minutes of expert advice, including from Richard and Owen here. So if you have questions about SourceLab and want to use it, and we'll be at AHA in Chicago, come join us. Finally, if you're looking for community and you feel like you're the only person doing this kind of work, Sunday at 9 a.m. session 254, The Lone Digital Historian will introduce you to people who have developed communities of practice and strategies for their own digital history work when they feel like they're on your own. It's a way for our audience members looking for a way to expand their research and teaching networks. If you are not a member of the AHA, I highly recommend that you join. We hope you'll consider supporting more programming like this. And since you are here and you've registered, you will have a recording of today's event emailed to you when the recording is available. You can send your questions and feedback to ahaonline@historians.org. Thank you all for attending, and please do reach out if you have questions. We will be distributing the syllabus that John mentioned so that you can think about how to adapt the SourceLab practices to whatever environment, whatever platform, and whatever resources you have in your own world. And on that note, I think we are done. Oh, John.
Sorry. Can I say something real quick? So
yes.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. And just to say that I would love to be in correspondence with anyone who finds this interesting. So please just write me an email, jwr@illinois.edu. Thank you.
Thank you so much.